ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
The perfect target for a serial killer.
They know the route, they know the system.
They know their victims.
I pushed the curtain back. My God.
What's going on?
Who did this?
A former nurse has been charged with murdering 2 elderly people at a Newcastle nursing home.
I maintain my innocence.
The Invisible Killer, an all-new series by Background Briefing. Hear it now on the ABC Listen app.
The world was shocked by Donald Trump's Oval Office clash with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. But as the US President cozies up to Russia, who wins beyond Vladimir Putin? Today, Dan Blumenthal, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a centre-right think tank, on what it all means for China's ambitions in our region and around the world. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards.
Playing cards.
But right now, you don't. Yeah, you're playing cards.
Mr. President.
You're playing cards.
Serious.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
The United States has cut off intelligence sharing with Ukraine in the latest sign of deteriorating relations between Washington and Kyiv.
Most European leaders have thrown their support behind Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy after a stoush with President Trump in the Oval Office last week.
We will go further to develop a coalition of the willing to defend a deal in Ukraine. Europe must do the heavy lifting.
The French president told the French people that he wants to believe that the United States will remain by Europe's side, but we must prepare for the possibility that they may not.
At least 25 people have died in Ukraine in the latest wave of Russian airstrikes.
The US president threatened to impose large-scale banking sanctions and tariffs on Russia, but later, from the Oval Office, he again focused his criticism on Ukraine.
I think we're doing very well with Russia. I'm finding it more difficult, frankly, to deal with Ukraine.
Dan, a lot has been happening when it comes to Donald Trump and international diplomacy. That is a wild understatement, of course. Broadly, how have you perceived what's going on?
Well, I look very carefully at relations between the United States, its allies, and China. And so I think we're headed into a very difficult period with China. I think it's a very dangerous moment for the United States because I think that the Russians and the Chinese perceive that the U.S. commitment to its alliances and its commitment to upholding the world order is weakening, and that the United States is acting more unilaterally and more on its own. So I think it's a fairly dangerous moment right now.
And that extraordinary exchange between Donald Trump and the Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
I don't think you'd be a tough guy without the United States. And your people are very brave. But you're either going to make a deal or we're out. And if we're out, you'll fight it out. I don't think it's going to be pretty.
How would China view that?
Well, China would perceive that the Russians are quite satisfied that the United States seems to be pressuring the Ukrainians more than they're pressuring the Russians. And since the Chinese have backed the Russians completely in its war of aggression against Ukraine, they would see their bet on Russia as paying off. As it relates to U.S. relations with Russia and NATO, any perception by the Chinese that there's a rupture in U.S.-NATO relations will be perceived as an opportunity for China to press against U.S. allies in the Asia-Pacific. But of course, there's a rupture between the EU and the U.S. as well. Now, that doesn't have as many security dimensions, but the Chinese, of course, would see an opportunity to perhaps cozy up more to some of the European nations who would feel that the United States has betrayed them on a core security interest for Europe.
But would the Europeans trust Beijing, given how close it is to Russia?
I think what you would see is more hedging of bets. So not necessarily trusting Beijing in a full alliance, but realizing that they would have to not take as strict countermeasures against Beijing as Washington wants them to take in order to make sure that China is at the very least neutral with respect to European interests.
Well, Dan, let's unpack the dangers that might come with all of this in your view. Tell me, what is the biggest threat that we could see from China because of this manoeuvring that we're seeing from Donald Trump?
Well, there is a possibility that the Chinese take what they're doing right now, which I call a comprehensive campaign of coercion against its neighbors, against Taiwan, against the Philippines, at a lower level against Japan, even increasingly against Australia and New Zealand. There's a possibility that it decides that it can escalate its campaign of coercion and, in fact, conduct a full-scale war against Taiwan. And that's the biggest danger, is the Chinese reads into the U.S. backing away from commitments and aid it's made to Ukraine, and the Chinese reading that as a lack of commitment to allies and partners more globally.
Well, during his presidency, Joe Biden made it clear that US forces would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion, including during an interview with 60 Minutes in the United States on CBS. That was back in 2022.
Would US forces defend the island?
Yes, if in fact there was an unprecedented attack.
US men and women would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion?
Yes.
Would Donald Trump do that, though?
Well, Joe Biden certainly said that a number of times. Unfortunately, those commitments were watered down by his staff afterwards, leaving far more ambiguity, I think, than necessary with respect to U.S. defense commitments against Taiwan. President Trump, in his comments about Taiwan, won't commit either way.
I never comment on that. I don't comment on anything because I don't want to ever put myself in that position. I have a great relationship with President Xi. I've had a great relationship with him. We want them to come in and invest. I see so many.
But he has said that he thinks Xi Jinping would be making a big mistake if under his watch he tried to take Taiwan. So he's trying to send a deterrent message. But the problem is any withering away of the U.S. commitment in Europe will be read by China as a withering away of U.S. alliance commitments and partner commitments around the world.
And the concern, of course, has been since the start of Russia's war in Ukraine that if Russia can invade Ukraine like that, China can certainly invade Taiwan, perhaps when the conditions are right.
Well, that's right. And what's very worrisome is because China has helped Russia so much in terms of its war machine, in terms of its trade, in terms of keeping its economy alive, China will call in a debt one day to Russia, and that debt may be that China asks it to distract the West in Europe while China attacks Taiwan. That's a very worrisome scenario. We're not there yet, but we have to consider the fact that China is going to ask Russia for things in return.
Well, let's have a look closer to our home, to Australia. In recent weeks, Dan, of course, we've seen a step up in live fire military drills by the Chinese off the Australian coast.
Commercial pilots have been warned that Chinese warships are conducting military exercises in the area and may pose a hazard in the airspace between Australia and New Zealand.
The ADF only learnt about Chinese warships conducting a live firing exercise in the Tasman Sea after being alerted by aviation authorities half an hour after it began.
Which really alarmed Australian leaders because warnings weren't issued before those exercises began.
We believe it would be appropriate to have been given more warning of this potential event taking place.
What do you think the Chinese are playing at there? And does Donald Trump come into any of that at all?
I think this is beyond Donald Trump. I think the Chinese believe they're in a new era, as they define it, where they're a global power and they're going to exercise military power and naval power into the Pacific around Australia. They are irritated by Australia's joint exercises and joint freedom of navigation maneuvers with the United States around the Taiwan Strait, which of course are lawful and in accord with international law. In fact, they're upholding international law. But the Chinese are trying to say to the Australians and to New Zealand, you're not the only ones anymore that can exercise near us. We can exercise near you. And not only that, but we're going to form relationships around the Pacific Islands that really matter to you, Australia. We're exercising our power and our influence around Australia, not just closer in to Taiwan and Japan.
Should we be concerned by that?
I think it's very concerning. I think it's concerning both from the perspective of Chinese military power and projection, but also from the perspective of the kinds of pacts and agreements it signs with the Cook Islands and the Solomon Islands, and just more of a Chinese presence around Australia's neighbourhood.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is continuing his extensive 8-nation tour of the Pacific.
There have been protests in the Pacific nation of Cook Islands over recent moves by the government to sign an agreement with China.
Now, the federal government says it's deeply disappointed that Solomon Islands has signed a security pact with China.
And the plans do not have good intentions. The plans are to create a Chinese sphere of influence.
The Chinese ambassador to Australia told the ABC that his country's navy doesn't pose a threat and more warship visits to the region should be expected.
As a major power in this region, as a country that has so many things to look after, it is normal for China to send their vessels to different parts of the region to conduct various kinds of activities.
What do you think of those assurances from him?
Well, at least they're somewhat honest. I think the warship visits will be more frequent and will be regularized, but they do pose a threat. The Chinese have the biggest navy in Asia. They probably have the biggest navy in the world, and they mean to become the world's biggest maritime power and exercise their influence in that fashion and reshape the world order in that fashion. Their activities around Australia in the Pacific Islands and elsewhere do not support good governance and do not support Australia's security interests, in my view, or America's security interests, in my view.
All right. Well, Dan, if it is so that there is the creation of some sort of new world order because of Donald Trump and his actions, one of the winners, in your view, will be China, of course. How big a winner is it from all of this?
I think it's the biggest winner at the end of the day. If China perceives the United States as not being fully committed, even if the United States merely questions its old commitments, that could be a big risk, and that China, in fact, miscalculates and pushes its interests further than even the Americans are willing to go. But China is the only country that has the power and the wealth and the desire and the ambition to reshape the world order in its favor. So I think China becomes the big winner if the alliance system really takes a hit, both in NATO, in Europe, but I think that will reverberate throughout Asia as well. It's only a matter of time that China grows even more aggressive with respect to creating a world order that favors China over Western interests.
Then what about, Dan, a nation like Australia, an ally, a smaller, much smaller ally that would expect the US to come to our defence if needed? Can we expect that anymore? And if we can't, what should we be doing now?
Well, I'm optimistic that the United States will maintain its commitment to Australia. It's been a key ally and a key partner for the United States for generations. I would say in this particular time of questioning and of turmoil, Australia should be, in my view, raising its defense budget so that Donald Trump can't criticize it for not meeting its own burden. I think the U.S. and Australia have other interests that they can work on together that would be attractive to Donald Trump, including in the development of alternatives to China's critical minerals domination. So there are a number of things I think that the U.S. and Australia can be working on together. But I think in the era of Donald Trump, proving that one is meeting its defense commitments and its equal share of the burden is critical. In any case, I think Australia would be, well served to continue increasing its defense capabilities and defense budgets, just because the threat it faces, in my view, are very, very, very serious.
Dan Blumenthal is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a centre-right think tank based in Washington. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Cara Jensen McKinnon. Audio production by Adair Shepherd and Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.